Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Okay, welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here again with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. We're teeing up your second conversation with Dr. William Klemm. I'm looking forward to it, but I guess I want to kick it off by asking, great teachers are weird, yes?
Yes. Have you had some weird teachers? I have had many.
I've had many, and they are the great ones, and they are memorable. That's for sure.
Yeah, so there are teachers who are memorable and there are teachers whose teaching is memorable. And I thought we'll start off with that. So Louis Agassiz was a well-known and quirky 19th century Harvard naturalist who was known to put his brand new students through what came to be known as the ordeal with the fish. You know, when students began their semester with him, he would hand them an odorous or like stinky fish in a jar from his lab. And then the students were asked to set the fish in the pan, and all they were required to do is look at their fish. So while the students wondered what the heck was going on, Agassiz would leave, and then he would just come back and just ask the students, what did you see? And majority of them would just doodle their thumbs and say, no, nothing. I didn't see very much. He would encourage the kids to see and draw. And those were the only two tools he would give, is like, just observe the fish and draw and nothing else. So this would go on and on for days. And of course, many would lose interest. But here's the kicker. A famous entomologist and expert on grasshoppers, Samuel Scudder, was a student of Agassiz. And he is famously known to tell this account of his experience with Professor Agassiz. And he says, after many days, I could not see whatever the heck Agassiz was wanting me to see. But what began to happen to me is I realized that I am not good at this. And he says, I see how little I saw before. So after some deep thinking, Scudder describes that he had an epiphany. And he blurted out when Agassiz got back to the class, he says, paired organs, the same on both sides. And Agassiz happily nodded. And he says, of course. And Scudder was so excited that he thought his job was done. And so he looked at Agassiz and said, so what next? And you can guess the answer. So Agassiz said, well, look at the fish. So what I love about this story is, number one, is on many students, this technique of, pay attention, learn, observe, immerse was lost on them. They thought this was a little quirk of this weird professor, and most of them did not take it up and ran with it. However, there was this, again, one student for whom this awakening happened, and he saw the connection. And as we get ready to talk to our guest in a second episode, I think it's really important to understand the link between learning and teaching, and teacher and the learner relationship. The questions one must ask is, how am I inspiring my students? How do I engage them? How do I challenge them? How do I get out of their way? Yet, how do I stay there with my students? And that's why we are having Dr. Klemm come back. Here's a little bio of him that I think most of you heard, but he is a professor of neuroscience at Texas A&M University, who has served as a project director for 2 NIH grants and 2 other grants from NSF, all aimed at developing science curricula for grades 6 to 8. He has studied basic and applied research on learning and memory and has published 20 books. Several of them are available online, and I'm going to link it for all of you so you can take advantage of reading them. He provides teachers with lectures and workshops on teaching and learning. He's a distinguished lecturer, Sigma Xi, and the Scientific Research Society. He also is co-founded a company called Forum Enterprise, as well as he's a co-developer of GetSmart, an interactive internet-based instructional assistant. And finally, what he's most known for those who read psychology today, and he has his own blog called Thank You Brain, will realize that he has had more than 2.5 million reader views of his post. So he's a prolific writer, a phenomenal teacher, and somebody who deeply cares about our future generation, particularly that tender age of middle school. So I'm very excited to have him back.
I am too. So let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's second conversation with Dr. William Klemm.
Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Klemm. I'm so delighted to have you. Today, I thought we will focus on learning. You have written several books on this. You have wonderful insights on how to inculcate learning principles into the classroom. So let me start for all our audiences. What do you think? How do you define learning? And are memory and learning related?
Oh, yeah, of course. Learning is one side of the same coin as memory. In other words, you can learn things which you may or may not remember, but you can't remember things you haven't learned. And now, learning, it seems to me, involves two things. One is encoding the information. In other words, having the information register in your brain. But learning also involves understanding and the ability to recognize the meaning of what your brain just encoded. So that does not necessarily involve memory, except to the extent that your ability to understand very often requires you to recall some relevant memory, to help explain, to use what you already know to explain what you're now supposed to learn that's new. But I guess my philosophical point of view is, what's the point of learning if you don't remember it?
So true. So here's what I see. I deal with a lot of smart, talented underachievers because they have executive dysfunction. That's why they come to see me. They have ADHD. They have great IQ. A lot of them have been tested. And so their ability to memorize or information when they're during the younger grades is fine. And that's why they, easily they're floating through their academic life. Then comes this middle school onwards, this journey where you have to not just listen and memorize and reproduce, you have to understand and apply. And that's when they start struggling because they just don't have any proper techniques or even externalized understanding of their own ability to distinguish between learning and memory. So can you go a little bit deep into what does it mean to understand information? And how do we know we know?
Well, sometimes we don't know that we know. In other words, we misunderstand or we think we understand when in fact we don't.
Yes, and you only know that when you take a test.
Understanding is fundamental to memory in several ways. First of all, you don't want to memorize incorrectly. And the other point is that to understand something, you have to think about it. You have to think about it in the context of what you already know and understand. And the process of thinking about it is really memory rehearsal. So the best memory technique is actually thinking. And of course, in the process of thinking, you have a better chance of gaining understanding. Now you might say, well, do we teach children how to think? And that's a whole new subject, which we probably don't have time to explore. And it is probably the reason the education community has disrespected memory, because they think that memory is gained at the expense of thinking. And I take a different perspective and would contend that thinking helps memory and that memory helps thinking. You can't think in a vacuum. You have to know something to think. And to know something, you have to have memorized it at some point in time. So I think our educational approaches have been skewed against memory because they don't appreciate the interplay between memory and thinking.
Well, I see a fundamental problem in the way educators receive their training to become educators is they never get proper training in developing memory strategies. Or not all educators, like you can have a master's in physics and become a physics teacher, but you have never learned a learning theory.
That's right. And I've given talks to teacher groups, and at the end they say, "Oh, nobody ever told me that. Why didn't I know that when I was a student?"
So you mentioned this myth that the educators have amongst themselves. What's your first recommendation to educators if they want to see improvement in their student body in terms of general learning effort?
Well, first of all, I think they should learn these ideas about how to have an effective memory and teach it to the children.
I love
and
that.
that's
Yes.
the first fundamental. Now, the second fundamental is they need to rethink the classroom environment. They need to rethink the scheduling during the day and all of the distractions that go on in a typical school, which and there's so many things going on in school that interfere with learning that it's a wonder they learn anything.
Can you share some of the ones that you have observed?
Oh, well, I don't know where to start. Well, for instance, I've done a lot of school visits, and especially in the younger grades. If you walk into a typical classroom, it is just littered with distractions, all sorts of placards on the wall and doodads hanging from the ceiling. And you've perhaps seen that. If you go to a typical classroom, that's what they look like. And almost all school buildings have great big windows, and you can look outside and see what's going on outside. And all of these things are distractions. And it makes it very difficult to learn anything.
I'll give you an example.
And in addition to that, in a lot of classrooms, the public address system will come on about every 10 minutes with an announcement from the principal or from somebody else, and they'll talk about scheduled events later in the week and all sorts of other things for the kids to think about instead of the school lesson.
Oh my God, yes. Funniest example, I went to observe a 10th grader in a high school, and the biggest complaint came from his science teacher that he doesn't do his work. He's a nuisance to the other students and interferes with the whole classroom ongoings. So I showed up, I sat in the back, and there was a massive aquarium in the classroom. Okay. And that
another distraction.
Oh my God. And that made like a giant sound, almost like a dump truck was operating or something. And this kid sat right next to it, and it was lit up and had these amazing species of fish and all kinds of turtles. And it was giant. Like I could not believe it. Talk about the high school version of having these amazing slogans and things on the walls. This was so distracting to this kid. And he would spend a lot of time studying them. And then he would get very excited if something happened in the aquarium, and he would shout out, and that's what was going on.
And it's amazing the teacher didn't figure that out.
No, she didn't. And she was very annoyed with him for him not responding, because all she said to him every step of the way is stop doing that. Pay attention. Well, he was paying attention. He was very much paying attention to that.
Yeah. Teachers tell the kids to pay attention, and then they put all these distractions in the classroom where they can't pay attention.
So what should they do instead? That they are very afraid that the barren learning environment may be depressing.
Well, I think the teachers put all these distractions in the classroom because they want to make school interesting, keep it from being boring. But the price they pay for that is distracting the kids from the lessons they're trying to teach.
Yeah, I talk a lot about putting out the menu for the day, like the class hour, show the children what's coming up. So give them a little bit of a preview, put checks every time you get things done so they know they're progressing, so it's less boring. But to entertain them, I'm not a big fan of entertainment.
No, the entertainment is the distraction.
Exactly.
Now, one other thing that happens in every school, in college too, for that matter, is that, we have specialized curriculum so that in 1 hour period, we're doing chemistry, and another hour period, we're doing biology, and then we do history and so forth. And we're just jumping from subject to subject to subject. And there's very little cohesion across subjects. When in the real world, there is, but that's not the way we teach. We segregate our information. But anyway, in the typical class, it lasts, say, 50 minutes. Have you ever noticed what happens after about 45 minutes in a class? Everybody starts shuffling. They start putting stuff in their backpack, and they're shuffling around and so forth, and they're getting ready to go to the next class. Bell rings, they jump up, and go out into the hall and start talking to their buddies and go into their next class. All of this is now interfering with the consolidation of the information they supposedly learned in that previous 45 minutes. And I try to tell students what they ought to do when the bell rings is just sit there and think about what they supposedly learned in that 45 minutes, to do some rehearsal right then and there before they immediately get it erased by all these distractions of jumping up and running out into the hall, talking to their buddies and going to the next class on a different subject.
That's such a simple and profound strategy. And I completely agree with you. I feel there are other things that are forms of interferences, such as the teacher starts shoving homework assignments or project deadlines. Those are thrown out at the student last minute as the student is packing. So those are the last to be even processed or consolidated. So remember to remember processes interfered with as well, not just actually facts.
And now they've attached a negative emotion because nobody likes to do homework. and so they have all this information they want the kids to remember. And and by the way, this is going to be a terrible chore and you won't like going through it. That's sort of stepping on your own foot or counterproductive.
So anything else you have found successful in re-engaging the teachers to think a little bit about the cognitive process of attention, memory, and executive function? To me, the executive function is that self-awareness piece. How do I know I am going to forget? Do I have everything I need? Do I know that on previous tests I have done poorly? So if I don't change my strategy, I'm going to do poorly again. That insight-based self-management is quite poor as well. And I don't see much effort being put in that by teachers.
Yeah, and teenagers are not terribly self-aware in the first place.
Yes.
So you have to make it a point to teach them to be more introspective and think about themselves and, their state of mind and so forth. And related to this, I agree entirely with what you just said. Related to this is a matter of motivation. In fact, motivation is everything. If you're motivated, you will succeed. You'll find ways to make things work. So the emphasis ought to be on showing kids why they should want to learn this. And maybe you remember when you were a student, you'll ask the teacher, why do I have to learn this? That's the first question kids ask. They may not ask it explicitly, but in their own mind, they'll ask themselves, now, why do I need to learn this? And very often, it's just to learn it because the teacher said so.
Yes.
That's not very motivating.
No, not at all.
And worse yet, these days, you have to learn it because the state has standards that you got to satisfy. So now you got to learn it to make the teacher and the school look good. What kind of motivator is that?
So how can they improve motivation? What will really
you have to let the content, try to make the content interesting. All content is interesting if you don't have a negative attitude toward it. There's something interesting in that content that students can relate to, but maybe the teacher has to point that out.
Got it. No, I agree with you. I have seen that the teachers who love the topic that they're teaching tend to have so much extra knowledge that they bring about the experience they have had with that topic or that area of their interest.
And just rubs off.
The passion is so vividly clear to the students. It totally is clear. In closing, do you have you have written this amazing book called Better Grades, Less Effort. Can you talk a little bit about how can you be putting less effort and yet do well? What's the secret sauce for those who haven't read the book?
I originally wrote it in ebook form, so it wouldn't cost much. And then I recently now have it in paperback form. But in both cases, it's the same content. And the content is based on 20 tips. Actually, they're more like principles. And the very first one is to get motivated and be attentive. And, we just got through talking about some of that. And the second tip is on committing the time. Students especially don't realize how much time it's going to take, and they don't want to devote enough time to whatever the subject is. The third tip is don't memorize by rote. And that's what almost all of them do. And that's the least effective way to memorize anything. And also it takes a lot of time to memorize by rote. You have to go over it and over it and over it and over it. Whereas if you use images and so forth, it gets a lot more effective and easier. The fourth tip is to memorize only what you can't figure out. And I put that in there because memory is work. So, why do it if you don't have to? And secondly, if you can figure it out, it means you're thinking. And thinking, as I said earlier, is the best memory tool we have.
Such a secret sauce, yes.
And the fifth tip is on believe in your ability. A lot of, especially by the time they get to middle school and high school, too many students have got a negative attitude about their own ability. They'll say, well, I'm a C student, and, I'm just stuck with that forever. So attitude is really crucial to developing academic skills. The sixth tip is on reducing interferences. And in the earlier session, we talked some about that and the problems with multitasking and so forth, which brings us to the seventh tip is about, I try to explain to students about the multitasking culture they've grown up in and how it's interfering with their ability to learn. The eighth tip is on the value of thinking. Earlier I said that thinking is the best form of memory rehearsal. And in addition, it gives you the opportunity to improve your understanding, to make sure that you're memorizing the right stuff in the right way. The ninth tip is on self-testing. And a lot of students don't really know how to self-test. They think of just looking over their notes as a self-test, and it isn't. Next one is improving reading and listening skills. And students haven't been taught much about that either. And then the next tip is on the attitude of, I call it, bring your A game to class. If you really want to learn effectively, do it right then and there in class.
Isn't that the
Don't count on
simplest?
learning it later.
I
Learn it
tell
right there.
kids all the time. That's such a powerful, simple tip. Pay attention and bring your A game on and actually connect to the information right then and there. You're done.
Yeah. If you come with the attitude that I'm going to remember everything that's said in this class, you will do well in that class. You will remember more than the other students are remembering. And another tip is on organizing, how to learn how to organize your materials and the different note-taking techniques and things of that sort. And then I get into the tips about making associations, especially these visual mechanisms, peg systems and memory palace and story chains and things of that sort. Then there's a tip on tip of the tongue problems, where you really do remember, but you're having trouble recalling it. And so there are tips on how to deal with that. And I also have one on stress. Stress interferes with memory as a general rule, especially if it's chronic stress. Actually, it damages the brain. And kids are under enormous stress these days. I deal with college students, and all of them seem to be anxious about something.
I know.
And that interferes with learning. Negative emotions in general interfere with
Really
learning.
concerning, yeah.
And then lastly, there are tips on healthy lifestyles, which includes things like exercise. A lot of schools have eliminated recess, or even if they haven't, they sit in the stands and watch somebody else play basketball or things like that, and they're not really getting much exercise. And then the last one is get enough sleep. Students almost universally don't get enough sleep. And sleep is important because that's when you consolidate your memories from today's events. Even a nap, if you take a nap in the afternoon, it'll help you remember what you learned in the morning.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you so much for going over them and sharing your wealth of knowledge. You have been a terrific speaker, and thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate you coming on my podcast today.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share what I know.
All right. So that was, again, Dr. William Klemm. What a great conversation. I guess I want to lead off with this question, Sucheta. Memory and learning are inseparable. Do I have that right?
Yes. I think what I loved about what Dr. Klemm was talking about, that learning and memory are two sides of the same coin. He said you can learn without memory, but you cannot remember without having learned it. And this is something, if people keep at the heart of their educating their children or those who are adult learners, I think it will be really crucial for us to be successful in whatever we are trying to learn. And understanding is fundamental to learning, and it constitutes recognizing meaning. In my work, teaching comprehension to children and adults, I see two ways of doing it. What's the main idea or the essence of information, which helps with consolidation process? And the second is, what are the important yet relevant details? And I think those who have struggled with learning typically are struggling with both these ideas, which is what's the essence, what is the backbone of information, and deciding that discernment to know the details and their relevance. And again, most often these skills are taught in the classroom, but some people need more time and some people need more exquisite, individualized attention in learning these finessed skills. And if they don't get that, then they are the ones who fall behind. Of course, the way executive function plays a role here is to knowing how to manage learning is executive process. So kind of having a detective eye or like discerning eye and saying, you know what, this looks really hard. I think I'm going to forget it. And so those students who apply that self-knowledge tend to do better with strategies. So yes, I think the last thing is my understanding of the literature is also that more vivid the connection is made between the current information that is needs to be learned to prior knowledge, deeper is learning and its retention.
So, as I'm coming to understand, I mean, the environment around us needs to nurture the learning that our children and students are doing, right? So, what best can educators and parents do to facilitate this?
Yeah, and you heard Dr. Klemm and I talk a little bit about the way classrooms are structured. And, recently I did a webinar to almost 700 speech and language pathologists online, and several of them asked this question: then how can we facilitate the classrooms to have less information? They're decorated, they're made fun and attractive, but is that really helping? And I don't think many people are thinking about that. I think the most important thing is going back to this issue. Have we gotten learning wrong? Why do educators feel the need to rope the learner into learning? They have a lot of tricks in their bags, which is their genuine effort to make the classroom engaging rather than class learning more engaging. So the classroom being engaging versus the teaching being more engaging, that's the shift that can really add value. Loading the classroom walls with inspirational quotes, having seasonal decorations, simply not taking down the website that are displayed on from the previous class on these huge smart boards can be incredible amount of distractions. And not all learners are created equal. So some can handle it and some can't handle it. But I think let's create classrooms that can promote great attention and engagement and less burden on them warding off distractions. Another thing is that, it's really important that educators and parents too need to take in all the ideas that we discuss. So, cleaning up the classroom environment, removing distractions, minimizing disruptions. Even at home, I find that a lot of parents are cooking and they have their television on or their iPads. They have some music playing and the child is in the busy life. He's studying in the middle of where the life happens, which is great, but not so great. Some kids cannot function. Their fragmented attention just doesn't work. And the opposite of that is sometimes kids go into their bedrooms and close the door and nobody knows if they're paying attention or not. So I think kind of having a balance in the environment that will promote learning needs to be really thought through.
When you were saying that, I was thinking back to my college days, and I loved the idea of getting together with friends and student colleagues and study, but they all like to do it with music. And I could not concentrate on my studies when there was music playing. So you're right. Everyone is a wee bit different. So I guess continuing on, I mean, there is a case to be made for memorization, no doubt about it. I mean, what did you think of that discussion?
So important. I love quoting Dr. Klemm again, that educational approach has been skewed against memory. Somehow, somewhere, as people put faithful effort in getting children to problem solve and become independent learners, many educators have left the basic process as it relates to memory behind. I was reading something to get ready to interview Bill, and I came across this article in the Atlantic, and I'm quoting the author here, who said, over-reliance on memorization is like most problem in education, systemic. One teacher can't topple the tyrant's status alone, but she can begin to chip away at the base. Again, I love this kind of terrifying analogy here that memorization is a tyrant and we need to take it down. I mean, I understand that there are too many educators who rely simply on rote learning, but I do think that people have kind of lost sight of the important elements of learning through memorization. For generations and generations, people transmitted knowledge from one source to another, one human to another through memorization process. That can be a very effortful and stealth way of studying certain mind habits that can bring great sense of retention, which is essential to be successfully able to apply knowledge that you're learning. And, I love this. Another context I will give you that I'm not sure, Todd, but many teachers allow students to bring in something called cheat sheet, which is a sheet full of formulas in physics or quotes in English or things like that to the class. And they are allowed to use that as a reference to trigger the thoughts that they need to recall to answer the questions on the test. What's interesting about that is that the students who struggle are primarily struggling in knowing thyself and knowing the task directionality, which is what is important and why does it matter. So those students who are given a chance to create cheat sheet don't even know what content should go in the cheat sheet. That will be hard for me to recall. So again, going back to this process, when we are teaching independence to students, we need to teach them self-assessment, and we should not dismiss certain things just because they may appear to be foolish. So I think there needs to be a balance. And certainly I like to make a case for memorization myself.
Well, thinking about those, quote, cheat sheets that you mentioned, I mean, for me, on the occasion in my education where I could do that, I found the process of thinking through what to put on my cheat sheet was a helpful process towards my learning. So even that exercise itself was beneficial to me going forward, let alone using it for the testing. Interesting stuff. So I guess before we go, any closing thoughts?
Yes. I have often used this analogy on my podcast, the Goldilocks effect. I'm going to use that and apply that again to the process of learning memorization or just making students independent. You know how in Goldilocks, the chair was too big or the other chair was too small. And she searched around until she found just right. The porridge was too hot and the other porridge was too cold. Then she found just right porridge to eat. Similarly, I think all the students and teachers need to find that balance. Over-reliance and mindless memorization serves no purpose in students' life, particularly when it entails repeating the same fact or detail several times. Regurgitating back is not true memorization. Memorization is a very active, complex process of making deep connections with information. So there needs to be some organic processes that need to be built into it. And then students need to engage in practice in recall. This reminds me of a very cute story. I'm obsessed right now with a Sarah Koenig's podcast called Serial. In that, the first one is about a 1999 murder in Baltimore of Hae Min Lee, was a popular high school senior who disappeared, and they, arrested her ex-boyfriend Adnan Syed, and the story covers Adnan Syed's case. And in all that, what struck a chord with me was his lawyer, Maria Cristina Gutierrez. She was a prolific defense attorney, and as she would prepare her defense, she would stand in front of fourth grade students and make a case, her opening remarks. And then she would ask the students, do you understand me? And if they said no, then she would go back, redo it, and again present until the fourth graders could understand. I think that's a wonderful discipline that talks about that application of learning needs to be put to test. And I think we need to kind of tie all these components into a wholesome learning experience of our children. Finally, as I close, let's also not dismiss the cultural wisdom there, that there are lots of cultural elements that promote memory and retention, and we must alert the students about them. For example, the world-renowned psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who studies the concept of flow, talked about this in his book, and I'm quoting here, that lists of edible herbs and fruits, healthy tips, rules of behavior, patterns of inheritance, laws, geographical knowledge, rudiments of technology, and pearls of wisdom were all bundled into easily remembered sayings or verses. They were then transmitted from generation to generation. So there is a cultural component to memory and learning, and every person who has the responsibility of educating oneself or others must bring that into focus when they are dealing with learning. I hope that made sense, Todd.
It sure did. Lots of important things to think about there. Good stuff. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thanks for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.